I watched in horror as my beautiful floating dock drifted slowly into the middle of the lake. Wedding guests in their finest clothes were screaming and clutching the railings. The bride's white dress was soaking in lake water. Sheriff Karen was shouting orders that nobody could follow because there was nowhere to go. They were all trapped on my dock, floating away from shore like some twisted fairy tale. And the best part, I was the only one who knew exactly how to bring them back. But first, they had to learn what it felt like to be powerless. For 15 years, that dock was my sanctuary. I built every board, drove every nail, and painted every post with my own hands. The floating platform stretched 40 feet into Crystal Lake, connected to shore by a walkway that swayed gently with the waves. Most mornings, I would sit there with my coffee, watching the sun rise over the water and listening to the loons call across the lake. My neighbors always said I had the best spot on the entire lake. The water was deep enough for swimming, but protected from the worst storms by a small island about 200 yards out. I had installed underwater lighting that made the dock glow like something magical at night. During summer evenings, my wife and I would sit out there for hours, watching the stars reflect on the water and feeling grateful for the peace we had found. The dock was not just a structure to me. It was 15 years of weekend projects, of learning carpentry skills I never thought I would need, of saving money for better materials and higher quality hardware. Every section was built to last, engineered to handle ice in winter and storms in summer. I had researched floating dock systems for months before starting construction, studying weight distribution and anchoring techniques like I was preparing for a college exam. My wife used to joke that I loved that dock more than I loved her. She was wrong, but I understood why she said it. The dock represented something important to me. It was proof that a regular person could build something beautiful and lasting with enough patience and hard work. When my friends came over for barbecues, they always ended up out on the dock, marveling at how solid it felt despite floating on the water. The lake community was small and close-knit. We all knew each other and respected each other's property. If someone needed to borrow a tool or wanted to use a neighbor's boat ramp, we talked it through like civilized people. There were unwritten rules about noise levels, property boundaries, and common courtesy that everyone followed without question. We took care of each other and looked out for each other's places when people traveled. I had never had a single problem with law enforcement in my entire adult life. I paid my taxes on time, followed local ordinances, and treated police officers with the respect I thought they deserved. When deputies patrolled the lake during busy summer weekends, I would wave from my dock and sometimes offer them a cold drink if they stopped by. I believed in following the rules and working within the system to solve problems. That morning in early June, I was sitting on my dock with my usual cup of coffee when I heard the rumble of a patrol boat engine cutting through the peaceful silence. I looked up to see a county sheriff's boat heading straight toward my dock, moving faster than the no-wake zone allowed. Something about the aggressive way the boat was approaching made my stomach tighten with unease. Sheriff Karen Martinez climbed onto my dock without invitation, her boots hitting the boards with unnecessary force. She was a stocky woman in her 50s, with short gray hair and eyes that seemed to be constantly evaluating everything around her for potential threats or opportunities. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, and her badge caught the morning sunlight like a warning signal. "Nice setup you have here," she said, but it did not sound like a compliment. Her tone was flat and assessing, like she was appraising property at an auction. She walked around my dock, testing the railings and examining the construction details without asking permission. "Thank you," I replied carefully. "I built it myself over several years." Corinne nodded slowly, her eyes never stopping their examination. "Must have cost quite a bit. All this composite decking, the lighting system, the professional-grade hardware." She paused at the end of the dock, looking out over the water. "How deep is it here?" I told her the water was about 12 feet deep at the end of the dock, perfect for swimming and deep enough that the platform would not hit bottom even in the lowest water levels. She seemed pleased by this information, though I could not understand why. "I might have use for this place," Karen said abruptly. "My daughter is getting married in August, and we have been looking for the perfect venue. This dock would be ideal for a small wedding ceremony." The words hit me like cold water. "I am sorry, but this is private property. My dock is not available for events." Karen turned to face me directly, and her expression hardened. "I am not asking you, I am telling you. We would obviously compensate you for the use of your facility, but this is the perfect spot for what we need." I felt my heart rate increase. "Sheriff, I appreciate that you are looking for a nice venue, but I cannot allow a wedding on my dock. It is my private retreat, and I am not comfortable with strangers using my property." "Strangers?" Karen's voice took on a dangerous edge. "I am the sheriff of this county. My family is not comprised of strangers. We are your neighbors and public servants. I would think you would want to support your local law enforcement community." The way she said "local law enforcement community" made it clear this was not a request or even a negotiation. It was a demand backed by the authority of her badge. I realized I was dealing with someone who was not accustomed to hearing the word no. "I understand your position," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but this is still my property. I have the right to decide how it is used." Karen stepped closer, and I could smell the coffee on her breath mixed with something sharper, maybe anger or frustration. "Rights are interesting things. They exist as long as people respect them. But when someone becomes uncooperative with law enforcement, sometimes those rights become more complicated." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning breeze coming off the lake. This woman was telling me that my property rights depended on my willingness to cooperate with her personal demands. "Think about it," Karen said as she stepped back onto her patrol boat. "I will be in touch soon to discuss the details. I am sure we can work something out that benefits everyone involved." As her boat pulled away, leaving a wake that rocked my dock violently, I realized my peaceful morning routine had just been shattered by someone who saw my sanctuary as her personal resource to exploit. 3 days later, Karen returned with backup. 2 patrol cars pulled into my driveway while her boat approached from the water, effectively surrounding my property from both sides. My wife was at work, so I faced this intimidation alone, standing on my deck as uniformed officers positioned themselves like they were serving a high-risk warrant. Karen stepped onto my dock with the same entitled confidence as before, but this time she carried a clipboard and wore the expression of someone conducting official business. "I have good news," she announced. "We have finalized the arrangements for my daughter's wedding ceremony on August 15th. "I told you already that my dock is not available," I replied, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. "Nothing has changed since our last conversation." "Actually, everything has changed," Karen said, consulting her clipboard. "We ran a full inspection of your dock and discovered several code violations that need to be addressed immediately." She handed me a citation that listed violations I had never heard of: inadequate flotation capacity, non-compliant electrical systems, improper anchoring methods, and failure to register as a commercial facility. Each violation carried a fine ranging from $500 to $2,000. "This is ridiculous," I said, scanning the document. "I built this dock to exceed all local building codes. I have all the permits and inspection certificates." Those were issued under the old regulations, Deputy Williams interjected. He was a younger man who kept glancing nervously between Karen and me, as if he was not entirely comfortable with this situation. The county updated the waterfront construction codes last month. I knew this was a lie. I subscribed to all county notifications and had received no updates about waterfront regulations. But arguing with 3 armed officers on my own property felt like a losing proposition. However, Karen continued, we might be able to work out a solution. If you were to allow the county sheriff's department to use your dock for an official community relations event, we could consider that proof of your commitment to public safety. That might influence how strictly we enforce these new regulations. The extortion was now completely in the open. Karen was using her badge and her authority to steal my property for her daughter's wedding, and she was doing it with witnesses who would back up her version of events. This is not legal, I said, knowing how weak it sounded. You cannot just make up violations to force me to give you my property. Sir, I would suggest you be very careful about making accusations against sworn law enforcement officers, Deputy Rodriguez warned. He was older than Williams and seemed more comfortable with Karen's tactics. Making false statements about police conduct is a serious matter. I felt trapped between the dock and the house, surrounded by people with guns and badges who were making it clear that my rights only existed at their discretion. My hands were shaking as I held the citation, trying to process how quickly my quiet life had become a nightmare. The wedding is in 6 weeks, Karen said matter-of-factly. That gives you plenty of time to make the necessary repairs to bring your dock up to code. Of course, if you choose to donate the use of your facility for our community event, those repairs might not be necessary. After they left, I called my lawyer, a family friend who had handled my property purchases and will preparation. He listened to my story with growing concern, then delivered the news I was dreading. Technically, they can cite you for violations if they claim the codes have changed, he explained. Fighting it would require hearing a specialist in municipal law, which could cost $20,000 or more. Even if you win, they could just find other ways to make your life difficult. So I have no recourse. Your best bet might be to comply with their request, and then file a complaint with the state attorney general after the fact. But that is a long process with no guarantee of results. I hung up the phone feeling more helpless than I had ever felt in my adult life. Karen had turned my own government against me, and there seemed to be no way to fight back without risking financial ruin. The invasion of my property began 2 weeks before the wedding. A florist truck pulled into my driveway at 7 in the morning, followed by a catering van and a rental company delivering white folding chairs. I stood on my deck in my bathrobe, watching strangers unload supplies for an event I had never agreed to host. "Excuse me," I called out to the florist, a middle-aged woman with paint-stained hands and a tired expression. "I think there has been a mistake. No one has permission to use this property." She looked confused and pulled out her phone to check something. "I have the work order right here. Sheriff Martinez personally approved this location for her daughter's wedding. Are you not the property owner?" Before I could answer, Karen's patrol car pulled up behind the delivery trucks. She emerged wearing civilian clothes but carrying herself with the same authoritative bearing that made her uniform unnecessary. "There is no mistake," Karen announced loudly enough for all the vendors to hear. "This is the official venue for the Martinez wedding ceremony. Mr. Thompson has graciously agreed to host the event." I felt my face burning with anger and embarrassment. "I have not agreed to anything. This is my private property, and I want all of you to leave immediately." The vendors looked uncomfortable, caught between conflicting instructions from the property owner and the sheriff. Karen stepped closer to me, lowering her voice to a tone that somehow sounded more threatening than shouting. "Mr. Thompson, I strongly suggest you do not create a scene in front of these hardworking people. They are just trying to do their jobs, and you would not want to be responsible for disrupting a young couple's wedding day." The manipulation was masterful. Karen had positioned herself as the reasonable authority figure while making me look like the uncooperative obstacle. The vendors watched our exchange with the uncomfortable fascination of people witnessing a domestic dispute. Over the next 2 hours, I watched my dock be transformed into someone else's dream venue. White fabric was draped along the railings, potted flowers were arranged in strategic clusters, and a small arch was assembled at the end of the dock where the ceremony would take place. Each addition felt like another theft of my personal space. When Karen's daughter arrived to inspect the setup, I was sitting on my deck feeling like a prisoner in my own home. She was a pleasant-looking young woman in her 20s who seemed genuinely excited about her upcoming wedding. I felt sorry for her, knowing she had no idea that her special day was built on her mother's abuse of power. "This is absolutely perfect," the daughter gushed, taking photos of the decorated dock. "Mom, you were right about this being the most beautiful spot on the lake." Karen beamed with pride, accepting credit for my 15 years of work as if the dock had materialized through her personal efforts. "Only the best for my baby girl," she said, putting her arm around her daughter's shoulders. I tried one more time to reach someone in authority who might listen to reason. I called the county commissioner, the state police, and even the FBI field office in the nearest city. Each conversation followed the same pattern: expressions of concern, promises to look into the matter, and eventual explanations about jurisdictional limitations or insufficient evidence. The local newspaper was not interested in a story about a property dispute, especially when it involved criticizing the sheriff. The radio station hung up when I tried to explain the situation. Even my neighbors, people I had considered friends for years, seemed reluctant to get involved in a conflict with law enforcement. By the evening before the wedding, I was sitting alone on my deck, looking at my transformed dock and feeling completely defeated. Karen had not just stolen my property. She had isolated me from my community and made me feel like a criminal for trying to protect what was mine. The worst part was knowing that after tomorrow, she would probably find other ways to make my life miserable if I complained about what had happened. That night, I could not sleep. I kept staring out my bedroom window at the dock, now decorated with white ribbons and flowers that looked like a mockery of everything I had built. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went down to my workshop in the basement. I had not thought about the dock's construction details in years, but now every technical specification came flooding back. The platform floated on 12 sealed foam-filled chambers, each one carefully positioned to distribute weight evenly. The entire structure was anchored to the lake bottom by 4 heavy-duty anchors connected to the dock by marine-grade cables. But there was something Karen did not know, something no one knew except me. I had installed a quick-release mechanism on the anchor cables as a safety feature. In case of extreme weather or ice damage, I could disconnect the anchors remotely and let the dock float free rather than risk structural damage from forces beyond its design limits. The remote control was sitting in my workbench drawer, covered in 5 years of dust but with a battery that still showed a full charge. I had tested the system once after installation, watching the dock drift a few feet before reconnecting the anchors, but I had never had cause to use it in an emergency. As I held the remote in my hands, a plan began forming in my mind. It was not a good plan, and it was certainly not a legal plan, but it was the only way I could think of to reclaim some dignity from this situation. If Karen wanted to use my dock for her daughter's wedding, then she would get exactly what she asked for. I spent the rest of the night calculating timing and wind conditions. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 in the afternoon, when the prevailing winds would push a floating dock steadily toward the middle of the lake. The water was deep enough that even if someone jumped off the dock, they would have to swim at least 300 yards to reach shore. The moral weight of what I was considering kept me awake until dawn. Innocent people would be affected by my revenge, including Karen's daughter and her guests who had no idea they were participating in a theft. But I also knew that if I did nothing, Karen would continue using her badge to bully other people in the community. By morning, I had made my decision. I would let the ceremony begin normally, wait until everyone was gathered on the dock, and then activate the release mechanism. It would be dramatic and frightening, but probably not truly dangerous. The dock was unsinkable, and rescue boats could reach them within an hour. I hid the remote control in my pocket and went upstairs to make coffee, watching through my kitchen window as the final wedding preparations began on my stolen dock. Today, Karen was going to learn what it felt like to be powerless. The wedding guests began arriving at 2 o'clock, parking along my driveway and walking across my yard like they had been invited to use my property. I watched from my kitchen window as people in formal attire made their way down to the dock, many of them stopping to admire the view and compliment the beautiful venue. Karen appeared in a navy blue dress that somehow still made her look like she was wearing a uniform. She directed the guests with the same authoritative manner she used for police operations, positioning family members for photos, and ensuring everyone knew where to stand during the ceremony. The bride arrived at 3:30 in a white sedan decorated with ribbons and tin cans. She looked radiant in her wedding dress, completely unaware that her special day was built on her mother's corruption. Her groom was a nervous-looking young man in an ill-fitting tuxedo who kept tugging at his collar and checking his watch. I felt sick to my stomach as I watched the ceremony begin. The officiant, a local pastor who probably had no idea about the circumstances, spoke about love and commitment while standing on my stolen dock. The bride and groom exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to support each other through whatever challenges life might bring. 37 people were gathered on my dock when I finally pulled the remote control from my pocket. I could see Karen standing proudly behind her daughter, basking in the glory of what she had accomplished. She caught my eye through the kitchen window and gave me a small, victorious smile that made my blood boil. I pressed the button. Nothing happened for the first few seconds. The anchor release was designed to be gradual, allowing the cables to unspool slowly rather than snapping free all at once. The pastor continued speaking about the sacred bonds of marriage while my dock began its silent drift away from shore. The first person to notice was a child, maybe 8 years old, who pointed toward the shoreline and said something to his mother. She looked where he was pointing and her face went pale as she realized the distance between the dock and the land was slowly increasing. "We are moving," someone said in a confused voice. The pastor stopped mid-sentence and looked around uncertainly. The bride and groom turned to see what was happening, their faces shifting from confusion to concern as they realized they were floating away from shore. "What the hell is happening?" Karen demanded, her authoritative voice cutting through the growing murmur of worried guests. That was when the panic began. Someone screamed as they realized how far they had already drifted from shore. An elderly man tried to jump into the water but was pulled back by his wife, who reminded him he could not swim. Children started crying as adults rushed to the railings to look down at the deep water surrounding them. Karen was shouting orders, but for the first time in probably years, no one was listening to her. Her badge was at home, and her authority meant nothing to a floating dock that was steadily carrying her family into the middle of Crystal Lake. "Someone call 911," the groom shouted, but several guests were already on their phones, discovering that their location was now moving and impossible for emergency responders to pinpoint. The bride's wedding dress was getting wet from people splashing as they leaned against the railings. Her carefully styled hair was coming undone in the wind that was pushing the dock steadily away from shore. She looked like she was about to cry, and I felt a stab of guilt for ruining what should have been the happiest day of her life. Karen spotted me standing in my kitchen window and pointed directly at me. "He did this," she screamed across the widening gap of water. "Thompson sabotaged his own dock." But her accusation carried no weight now. She was just another stranded person on a floating platform, as powerless as everyone else to change their situation. The authority that had allowed her to steal my property was useless against the simple physics of wind and water. By the time the first rescue boat arrived 20 minutes later, my dock was 300 yards from shore and still drifting. The wedding party was huddled in the center of the platform, soaked by spray and frightened by their complete helplessness. Karen's perfect plan had become a disaster that would be talked about in the community for years to come. The rescue operation took 2 hours and required 3 boats from the county sheriff's department and 2 from the state police. I watched from my deck as emergency responders worked to evacuate 37 wedding guests from my floating dock, now anchored in 15 feet of water near the middle of the lake. The bride was crying as she was helped into a rescue boat, her wedding dress ruined and her special day destroyed. I felt genuinely sorry for her, but I also knew that her mother's actions had made this confrontation inevitable. Karen was among the last to be rescued, and even from a distance I could see her pointing toward my house and gesticulating angrily to anyone who would listen. Within an hour of the last guest being brought to shore, 2 detectives were knocking on my door with questions about how my dock had become disconnected from its anchors. I told them truthfully that I had installed a safety release system years earlier, but I claimed ignorance about why it might have activated on its own. "Remote control mechanisms sometimes malfunction," I explained, showing them the dusty remote that I had hidden back in my workshop drawer. "I have not used this system in years, so I cannot say what might have gone wrong with it." The investigators were suspicious but could not prove intentional sabotage. The dock's safety release system was documented in my original construction permits, and there was no law against having a remote control for my own property. They warned me that if evidence emerged of deliberate action, I could face charges for reckless endangerment. Karen was not satisfied with the investigation's inconclusive results. 2 days after the wedding disaster, she appeared at my door with a lawsuit seeking damages for emotional distress, property damage, and intentional interference with a family celebration. The lawsuit demanded $50,000 in compensation and asked for a restraining order preventing me from operating my dock safety systems without county supervision. But something unexpected happened as news of the wedding disaster spread through the community. Instead of sympathy for Karen and anger toward me, people began asking questions about how a sheriff had been able to commandeer private property for a personal event in the first place. The local newspaper, which had previously shown no interest in my complaints, suddenly found the story newsworthy. A reporter interviewed several witnesses who confirmed that I had repeatedly objected to the wedding being held on my dock without permission. Other community members began coming forward with their own stories of Karen's abuse of authority. A retired teacher told the newspaper about Karen threatening to arrest her for not moving her parked car quickly enough during a traffic stop. A small business owner described being cited for imaginary health code violations after refusing to provide free catering for a police department event. A family reported that Karen had threatened to take their children away when they complained about a deputy's excessive force during a domestic disturbance call. The county commissioners called for an investigation into Karen's conduct, and the state attorney general announced that his office would review complaints about abuse of authority in the sheriff's department. Karen found herself under scrutiny for the first time in her career, defending practices that had previously gone unchallenged. My lawyer advised me that Karen's lawsuit was unlikely to succeed, especially given the growing public support for my position. "You are being portrayed as the victim of police harassment," he explained. "A jury would probably see the dock incident as justified self-defense against official oppression." 3 weeks after the wedding disaster, I was sitting on my newly re-anchored dock when I received the news that Karen had been suspended pending investigation. Her badge and authority had been temporarily removed, while state investigators examined her pattern of using police power for personal benefit. 6 months later, Karen Martinez was no longer sheriff. The state investigation had uncovered a pattern of corruption that went far beyond stealing my dock for a wedding venue. She had been using county resources for personal projects, accepting bribes from contractors seeking county business, and intimidating citizens who questioned her authority. The final tally included 12 federal charges, ranging from official oppression to mail fraud to violation of civil rights under color of law. Karen's 20-year career in law enforcement ended with a plea bargain that sent her to federal prison for 4 years and required her to pay restitution to victims of her abuse. Her successor as sheriff was a younger man who made a point of visiting my dock during his first week in office, not to make demands but to apologize for his predecessor's conduct. "What happened to you should never happen to any citizen," he told me as we sat on my deck drinking coffee. "You had every right to defend your property, even if your methods were unconventional." The lawsuit Karen had filed against me was dismissed after her criminal conviction made it impossible for her to claim victimization. Her daughter and son-in-law, meanwhile, had gotten married again in a small ceremony at a local church, far away from any connection to their mother's corruption. I testified at Karen's sentencing hearing, not to ask for harsh punishment, but to explain how her actions had affected my family's sense of security and trust in law enforcement. "She turned my own government against me," I told the judge. "She made me feel like a criminal for trying to protect my property rights." The judge sentenced Karen to the maximum term allowed under the plea agreement, noting that her abuse of authority had undermined public trust in law enforcement and violated the oath she had taken to protect and serve the community. My dock became something of a local landmark after the wedding incident. Tour boats would point it out to visitors as the site of the famous floating wedding disaster, and people would ask to take pictures standing where the ceremony had been interrupted. I did not mind the attention, because it served as a reminder that ordinary citizens could still stand up to corrupt authority figures. The experience taught me that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with lawyers or politicians, but with creativity and the courage to say no to people who abuse their power. Karen had used her badge to try to steal what I had built, but in the end, my knowledge of my own property had given me the tools to expose her corruption. On quiet mornings, I still sit on my dock with my coffee, watching the sun rise over Crystal Lake and listening to the loon's call across the water. The peace I had worked so hard to create has been restored, made sweeter by the knowledge that I fought for it and won. My dock remains anchored securely to the lake bottom, but the remote control for the safety release system sits in my workshop drawer, clean and fully charged. Not because I expect to need it again, but because it reminds me that sometimes the most effective weapons against injustice are the ones nobody knows you have. The lake is peaceful again, but now it carries the memory of the day when one citizen's refusal to be bullied helped bring down a corrupt sheriff and restore justice to our small community.